reading the Old Testament wisdom literature, which is generally regarded as including the books of Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs. I mean, some would add the Psalms, or at least some of the Psalms, and the apocryphal book of Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus as it is sometimes known. But for our purposes this morning, we can confine ourselves to Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs and Job. Now, like you, I imagine, I've read these books many times before, but it was different this time. For the first time, I actually noticed that they each invoked in me a different sort of emotion, probably because I just read them straight through in just a few sittings. I started with Proverbs. And, frankly, Proverbs is hard going. It's a bit like wading through treacle, if truth be told. I didn't find it all that enjoyable. It's a bit like being back in school with a teacher hammering in again and again the basic rules of grammar or the essentials of arithmetic. I thought of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony when I was reading it. That highly recognisable beat. That there's just no escaping the unmistakable cadence of that two-note thumping. How can you possibly make a symphony out of two notes? Well, Beethoven somehow did, and so does Proverbs. But I tell you, it can give you a headache in the process. Wise people do what God says. Foolish people pay no regard. Good people prosper, bad people don't. And every few sentences, the teacher finds a way of saying exactly the same thing with a slightly different words or with slightly different illustration or emphasis, so that if you don't get the message the first time around, you're bound to get it the next. The way of God is wisdom. The way of the simple is folly. Indeed, does not wisdom cry out? Indeed, and what does it cry out? My mouth speaks what is true. My lips detest wickedness. All the words of my mouth are just. None of them is crooked or perverse. The memory of the righteous will be a blessing, but the name of the wicked will rot. The wise in heart accept commands, but a chattering fool comes to ruin. The man of integrity will walk securely, but he who takes crooked paths will be found out. It's all so cut and dried. Light and dark, right and wrong, truth and error, wisdom and folly, prudence and perversity, straightness and crookedness. You get it? Well, get it good, because you're going to need it. You're going to need it, and get it in your youth, preferably, over and over again. By contrast, Ecclesiastes starts out like a breath of fresh air. The teacher is replaced by a philosopher. Here at last is someone who recognises that while the theory of life may be straightforward, in practical reality, life is never black and white. Wisdom may be better than folly, just as light is better than darkness, but the philosopher observes that the same fate overtakes them both, the wise and the fool alike. As one dies, so does the other. At last, here is a recognition that life is complex, never meant to be easy. The wise man may have eyes in the back of his head while the fool walks in darkness, but the philosopher observes that neither will be long remembered. In days to come, both will be forgotten. I like it. Here is someone who, while not denying the simple rhythm of Proverbs, not even willing to escape it, is at least going to try applying it to all the complexities of life. After ploughing through Proverbs, I'm ready for the challenge. And as I move past Ecclesiastes 1 and 2 and enter into chapter 3, the sense of expectation builds with that magnificent reflection on there being a time for everything, a season and a purpose for everything under heaven. Oh, how observant, how wise. The rhythm of ordered moral simplicity is still there, but there's promise this time of escaping the primitive one-size-fits-allness of Proverbs. Well, we're talking of Beethoven. These things occurred to me. I thought of his Seventh Symphony, especially that dramatic second movement that provided the suspenseful, spine-tingling crescendo to the movie The King's Speech, if you remember that, Just like that. But it builds eerily with the expectation that even one can't escape the monotonous rhythm. And it still keeps going on. One can at least experiment with it in the hope of breaking out to some higher heavenly composition. Maybe at long last we can finally swap the discipline of the schoolyard for the freedom of an adult education. But when we get into chapters 4, 5 and 6, frankly, the wheels just fall off. When the promise of the early chapters is sorely betrayed. The schoolyard rhythm of Proverbs is replaced by a morbid grown-up drone of utter despondency. Our philosopher becomes a serious mental depressive. Proverbs might have been like wading through treacle, but Ecclesiastes is like stumbling around in a mortuary. Like chapter 6, a man may have 100 children and live many years, says our philosopher, yet no matter how long he lives, if he cannot enjoy his prosperity, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. The child comes without meaning, it departs in darkness, and in darkness its name is shrouded. Though it never saw the sun or knew anything, that stillborn child has more rest than does the man, even if the man lives 1,000 years, twice over, but fails to enjoy his prosperity. Oh, yeah, right. In this meaningless life of mine, I have seen both of these things, the righteous perishing in their righteousness and the wicked living long in their wickedness. Who knows the explanation of things? Meaningless, meaningless is all meaningless. And the end of the matter in chapter 12, he almost, I think, spits it out. Some people think it's so not. Fear God and keep his commandments, because God will judge us for everything we do. Heads he wins, tails you lose. Get it? You may think I'm being a bit unkind to Solomon, if indeed he was the author of Ecclesiastes as is generally understood. It's true that we don't know his relationship with God at the end of his life, but the sense I get is that of a melancholic, embittered old man who had it all, only to let it slip through his fingers. In any event, it's in a very depressed mood that we come to the Song of Songs. Now, at first, the love poetry strikes one as a bit over the top. Is this for real? Well, what am I to get out of this? If Ecclesiastes is the voice of depression, the Song of Songs is a bit, excessive. But it is refreshing. It's like we've come out of the dreariness of winter into the innocence of spring. I mean, literally, you can almost smell the jasmine in the air. My lover spoke to me and said, "Arise, my darling, my beautiful one, come with me. See, the winter is past. The rains are over and gone. Flowers appear on the earth. The season of singing has come. The cooing of doves is heard in our land. The fig tree forms its early fruit. The blossoming vines spread their fragrance. Arise, come, my darling, my beautiful one, come with me." And so it continues. Sure, there are occasional glitches, like in chapter 5 when the bride plays hard to get and the moment passes. I mean, love is like that. But they soon recover their innocence and resume their blissful encounters. In the Song of Songs, we've left the schoolyard, left the intellectual campus with its depressing introversion and pointless musings, and we've entered into the sweet fragrance of a heavenly garden of pure delight. If we're following the pattern of Beethoven's symphonies, then in the Song of Songs, we're at Beethoven's glorious Ninth Symphony, that great culmination of his life's work, where he takes the simplest, childlike melody, that ode to joy, and he raises it to glorious heights, breaking free of and transcending all rhythmic limitations in its process. It seems to me that he breaks every symphonic rule in the book, every now and then erupting in dazzling joy, only then to retreat to the gentlest, softest tones before exploding again with unfettered exultation. Free at last, thank God the man is free at last. And then there's Job. Job actually precedes Proverbs, Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs, but this time I read it last, and I'm pleased I did, because in a strange sort of way, it helped me make sense of the progression, the pattern that I'd noticed from reading the other books one after the other. By progression, I mean something like this: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs. The elementary, the sceptical, the profound. The prosaic, the cynical, the mystical. The institutional, the critical, the transformational. The unquestioned dictum, the sceptical analysis, the blissful synthesis. Now, there's no doubt about it. I didn't imagine this. There's an unmistakable pattern there. And I suggest that it's one that we're bound to encounter in life if, and I emphasise if, we actually take our discipleship really seriously, if we are intent on taking up our cross to follow our Lord, losing our lives in the process in order to gain them. And by the way, I've since discovered that the old Jewish scribes also believed that there was this familiar spiritual growth pattern reflected in their wisdom literature, the same threefold progression from the elementary to the sceptical to the profound, from the prosaic to the cynical to the mystical, from the institutional to the critical to the transformational, from the regimented moralist of Proverbs to the sceptical dissident of Ecclesiastes, on at last to the radical transcendent saint of the Song of Songs. Now, how might you ask, does the book of Job help? How does it highlight and clarify this same progression? Well, the same three growth stages are evident in the experiences of Job. We glean, for example, from the first chapter of Job that he was well grounded in the unmistakable fundamentals of spiritual life. The elementary, the prosaic, largely institutional, stage one. First, we learn from chapter 1 that Job was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He was utterly meticulous in his religious observances. Over the top, frankly. He went to extremes. Now, that's it for phase 1. We're not told any more about his experiences of elementary spirituality. We don't need to know any more. He was the most upright person of his generation. He had well and truly mastered his Proverbs. And don't think, by the way, that because that's all we're told about phase 1 of Job's life, phase 1 isn't important. Oh, it's important. It's foundational, absolutely essential. Job would have had no chance of surviving phase 2 of his spiritual life had he not so comprehensively mastered phase 1. But we can safely leave to our imagination our ideas about how he came to be such an outstanding godly man. It doesn't matter as far as the story is concerned. Quite simply, he was just, blameless and upright. He's as close to perfect as anyone's going to get. In the same way, we don't need to say much about phase 3 of Job's spiritual journey. It's all contained in just 8 verses at the end of the last chapter 42, which tell us that after Job interceded for his 3 friends, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. The latter part of his life was blessed far beyond even that of his earlier life. He had more of everything: children, flocks, herds, cattle. He lived another 140 years. He saw all his children and grandchildren grow up and settle down, and when he died an old man full of years, purified and fashioned to the exact point for which God had created him. Phase 1 of Job's life is described in 5 verses of chapter 1. Phase 3 in 8 verses of chapter 42. And all we need to know about those phases is that he started out well and he ended up even better. And bookended between those 13 verses, we have 1,057 verses, I think it is, devoted entirely to growth phase 2. Why the imbalance, you say? Well, because I would suggest phase 2 is where nearly all of the significant Bible commentary on any true disciple's earthly journey is based. In all the complexity, the paradox, the frustration, the pain, the grief, the unanswered questions of daily life. Phase 2 is the very necessary bridge, the absolutely unavoidable transmission or transition from the elementary to the profound, from the institutional to the transformational, from the foundational to the mystical, if we want to call it that. Phase 2 is the bridge. It's all about the process of becoming. It should also logically be where most of the true disciples' earthly journey takes place, but I'm afraid that's not always the case. In fact, sadly, I think it's seldom the case. Institutionalised religion in phase 1 spends an enormous amount of time and energy endeavouring to keep its adherents locked in phase 1, in trying to convince them never to challenge the institution, never even to question it, because it's not worth the risk. You might fall off the edge of the earth if you do. And yet even within the book of Job, describing Job's great phase 2 trauma, we find constant echoes of the phase 2 process of becoming something more, of coming out of phase 1. Job himself instinctively sensed that even though he couldn't engage with God in the way that he wished, God hadn't abandoned him. God never gave up on Job, and Job never gave up on God. As far as Job was concerned, God was still active, doing something in his life that he couldn't understand, something that he couldn't intelligibly come to grips with because he couldn't engage God. That really is fundamental to understanding the book of Job. He had moved beyond stage 1, the stage 1 need for the constant reinforcement of godly proverbs. It was time to, as Hebrews 6 would put it, to leave aside the elementary teachings of Christ, not laying again the foundation of repentance from acts that lead to death and of faith in God, instruction about baptisms and so on. It's time to move on. He had moved on from that and was now pressing on to maturity, facing off against the unrelenting complexities, the grim paradoxes of phase 2 everyday life. The simplistic repetition of what were in fact scripture quotes and a doctrinal wisdom just didn't cut it anymore for him. Not in the situation he was in. My ears have heard and understood all this, he says in chapter 13. What you know, I also know. I am not inferior to you. And all his friends had in response, all they could offer were one-dimensional platitudes from their phase 1 learning, simplistic aphorisms, allegedly supported by proverbial texts, stretched to justify their simplistic knee-jerk responses. Zophar, for example, in chapter 11, "Oh, Job, if only you would devote your heart to him and stretch out your hands to him. If you put away the sin that must be in your heart and allow no evil to dwell in your tent, then free of fault you will finally lift up your face. You will surely forget your trouble. Life will be brighter than noonday. You will be secure and many again will court your favour." It was enough to anger Job, to drive him to the depths of sarcasm in his chapter 12 reply. "Doubtless," he says, "you're the only people who matter, and wisdom will die with you. But I have a mind as well as you. I'm not inferior to you. Who does not know all these things?" There comes a time in the believer's life when The answer to spiritual dilemma goes way beyond a reference to Romans 50 verse 60 or Corinthians 20 verse 90. And so Job continues, I desire to speak to the Almighty. I want direct contact. I want to argue my case with God. Meanwhile, you just smear me with lies. You're all worthless physicians, all of you. If only you would be altogether silent. For you, that would be wisdom. Would it turn out well if God examined you? Would not his splendour terrify you? Would not the dread of him fall on you? Your maxims are proverbs of ashes. Your defences are defences of clay. Job was now way beyond the simple one-quote fix of phase 1. And yet, unlike the Ecclesiastes philosopher of phase 2, Job was sufficiently mature to know that life wasn't meaningless. He sensed intuitively that he was in the advanced stages of a state of becoming. A shockingly painful, horrendously agonising state of becoming. Becoming what? Well, he had no idea, because God's way was hidden from him. That was his frustration, but he sensed that something was afoot. And so into chapter 14, amid his continuing misery, he muses about something vaguely positive. Who can bring the pure from the impure? Nobody. No one. Not me, certainly not you. But God can. And yet nothing has been said to this point about any purification process. The message of the three friends was simply to remind Job that he just must be living in unrepented sin. And they wanted to goad him into coming clean with it. But undeterred, Job continues his soliloquy in that same chapter 14. At least there is hope for a tree. If it is cut down, that it will sprout again and its new shoots will not fail. If only God would hide me in the grave. It's a beautiful expression, to hide me in the grave and conceal me till his anger is past. If only he would set a time and then remember me. If a person dies, will he live again? All the days of my hard service I will wait for my renewal to come. Again, there's a glimmer of hope with that expression, my renewal. He can finally see the promise of a phase 3 transformation. Maybe it'll only come after I'm dead. But if God wills it, so be it. Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. Job seems intent on seeing God at work in all the madness of his life. Even if he kills me, I won't give up on him. That's his determination. And so the dialogue with his friends continues. In chapter 19, Job implores them, have pity on me, my friends, have pity, for the hand of God has struck me. Interesting, the hand of God. Wasn't it Satan who was the author of all Job's suffering? Doesn't chapter 1 say that? Well, yes, in one sense maybe, but that doesn't mean God is inactive. God is ceaselessly at work. Remember Paul's timeless observation in Romans 8. In all things God works for the good of those who love him. That's a spiritual law of the universe, that Romans 8:28, by which I mean it applies always, everywhere, in all circumstances, throughout the universe, for all time, period. In all things, God works. Job intuitively knows it, but as to how, why and wherefore, well, he's in the dark. In that chapter 23 that we read this morning, we see another glimmer of the gradual unveiling of God's purposes. Job exclaims in verse 10, God knows the way that I take. But when he has tested me, I will come forth as gold. God testing Job. Again, chapter 1 attributes Job's trials and suffering to the work of Satan. It was Satan doing the testing, wasn't it? But however we understand the Satan of Job, and it doesn't matter for now, here is Job in the midst of his trauma claiming that God is really, underneath it all, the one who is testing him, that somehow God is still in charge, that nothing happens to the true believer that is at least not allowed by God, that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. In all things, even in the harshest trials, God still works, albeit in mysterious ways. You know, in analysing the book of Job, we mostly tend to focus on his physical suffering, and that's understandable, it's legitimate. But if we focus solely on the physical element of his suffering, we lose sight of what was even more traumatic for him, his spiritual suffering, if I can coin that phrase. Job desperately wanted God to engage him face to face. He wanted to plead his case with God, to understand what was going on, to have realistic, meaningful, relational discourse with heaven. He knew that his suffering had nothing to do with some dreadful sin he had overlooked, like his friends kept saying. Yet in all his agony, he now seems finally to have recognised intuitively that God has not been idle at any stage of his life, especially during the time of his greatest trial. God had been ceaselessly active, working on Job's behalf, purifying him, shaping him, gauging him, chipping away here and there, polishing him even into his absolute best self, better even than his chapter 1 appearance. The psychologist Carl Jung apparently once said, "The greatest and most important problems of life can never be solved, only outgrown." As with the natural, so with the spiritual. And there is a real sense in which that statement reflects the spiritual learnings of Job and sums up much of what I'm saying this morning. Invariably, the great strides in spiritual growth come hard, really hard. Nearly all of the great saints down through history have spoken of having to endure times when they felt anything but saintly. These times have been variously described as periods of darkness, periods of dryness, nothingness, times when their tried and trusted scriptural analyses have proved dissatisfying, when their religious practices were found wanting, when their standard go-to routines and solutions fell short. And in this they have all followed the pattern of Job. From that reading this morning in chapter 23, we have Job in the extreme agony of spiritual lostness and darkness saying, "If only I knew where to find him, if only I could go to his dwelling. But if I go to the east, he is not there. If I go to the west, I do not find him. When he is at work in the north, I do not see him. When he turns to the south, I catch no glimpse of him. I'm in the dark here. My feet have closely followed his steps. I have kept to his way without turning aside. I have not departed from the commands of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my daily bread. But he stands alone, and who can oppose him? He does whatever he pleases. He carries out his decree against me, and many such plans he still has in store. That is why I am terrified before him. When I think of all this, I fear him. God has made my heart faint. The Almighty has terrified me." Yet, he concludes, "I am not silenced by the darkness. I will not be silenced by the thick darkness that covers my face." Here was the man of God refusing to give up on God, to just curse God and die as urged by his wife. He would persist until the end, not silenced, never silenced by the thick darkness in which he was enveloped. Here at last, our disillusioned critic has become the transcendent saint. In the person of Job, we see the progression from the proverbial simplicity of the three friends, all through the dark and complex depths of the sceptical and critical as Job endures the paradoxical confusion of it all, finally out through to the end, to the radical transcendent and the transformational. In chapter 34, the young bystander Elihu makes a very astute observation in verse 23. He says, it's something we should bear in mind, I think. God has no need to examine people further that they should come before him for judgment. Judgment is not for God's benefit. That's what he's saying. It's for ours. God has no need to examine people further that they should come before him for judgment. The process of judgment, you see, is taking place right now, if we're up to it and awake to it. We have a skewed view of judgment. We generally imagine a sombre court environment with a grim judge presiding, about to deliver judgment against us. But the essence of judgment is assessment, evaluation, appraisal. And in God's case, the work that he is constantly appraising is his own work, us. We are God's workmanship. Ultimately, it's not about whether I've done enough. It's whether I've allowed God to do enough in shaping my being, conforming it to the image of the new man in Christ. Am I aware of what God wants to do with me right now in this life? Am I being cooperative, or am I resisting every move of the master craftsman? And most importantly, will I see it through to the end, through all the darkness of unknowing? God knows those who are his. It is for their benefit that he undertakes a process of purification and refinement in this present life. He is constantly assessing his work, weighing it, measuring it, gauging it, sometimes even polishing it. And what work does it still need to bring the master plan to completion? Call the whole thing judgment if you like, because that's exactly what it is. Judgment, assessment, appraisal, evaluation. Sometimes the process of becoming is bound to hurt if some major work needs to be undertaken. Will we buckle under the strain? Will we even give permission for the work to be carried out in the first place? Oh, but it hurts. Well, of course it does. But I don't understand what's going on. It doesn't make any sense to me. Well, that's because he's God and we're not. The judgment process is never finished in this life either. It will need to be completed on the great day of judgment to come. But the fires of that judgment to come will be familiar to those acquainted with God's ways. If the fires of judgment are mostly endured now, then what remains will most certainly be endured then. In closing, just back to the key themes. I heard it said recently, I think I read it somewhere, that modern Christianity has given rise to two broad classes of people. Firstly, there are those who throw the baby out with the bathwater, and I'm referring there to liberals and academics for whom the power of the gospel has tragically lost its appeal. And then on the other hand, there are those who drown in the bathwater while trying to save the baby. Like many traditionalists and fundamentalists, the broad grouping, I guess, to which we all mostly belong. And unless we learn to manage the transition from the theoretical and institutional to the practical and transformational, both as individuals and as a body, I think we doom ourselves to drowning in our own bathwater. The transition seldom comes easily or quickly like a moment of inspiration or a bolt from the blue. It usually comes via one of the many different forms of suffering or adversity that we can either face up to squarely and authentically or dismiss with some far too easy fake solution. It seems that frequently spiritual suffering is often the only thing that is strong enough to break down our perceived need to be in control, our stock standard explanations, our commonly accepted routines, our logical paradigms, and our carefully cultured sense of orderliness. Spiritual suffering is when God takes us to the limits of our private resources in these respects, offering us the chance to grow. Up to that point in our lives, it's largely just been mental belief systems, the spouting of orthodoxies, which frankly mean very little in and of themselves. And then perhaps some event, some person, some moral complexity takes us to the point where we are forced to admit, I can't do this. I have to move on. I can't make sense of it. I can't see my way through it. I'm in the dark here. And rather than despair, we should learn to see this as an opportunity for spiritual growth, another step in the transforming transition to which we've all been called. As a body and as individuals, we need to recognise the spiritual growing pains in one another and then help each other manage that growth transition.